Today marks the start of an era the world has definitely seen before, because today I will be bringing to you what I plan to be a recurring series on this channel. This series, not having a title right now, but it is essentially going to be my playthrough journeys. Yes, folks, that is correct. I'm going to be bringing you a description of every single game that I've been playing semi frequently for the last couple years straight to your eyeballs. So let's get into it. Now, the main reason that I'm making these videos is more so to work on my storytelling ability, but I figured that to do them from a perspective of the games that I've been playing might be interesting as well. So it should be no surprise when I say that the games that I'm starting off this series with are from the Dark Souls series, given that practically every person tangentially related to gaming has either analyzed, criticized, or just played the games before. Now, the question you might be having is what's going to set me apart? And the answer for that is that there's going to be no proper game capture actually being displayed in the video. Most of it is actually going to be from a series of screen caps that I've painstakingly taken over the last couple months. Now you might ask, why am I doing this? Yes, I don't have the proper game capture equipment, but I thought it might be kind of interesting to do it this way because I could kind of curtail and kind of like curate which kinds of images I was able to show, which I thought might be a little more interesting than just like, my really bad gameplay, honestly. What's also going to be different than some other playthroughs you might have seen is that the order of the games is going to be a bit unorthodox because I actually didn't start with the original Dark Souls. So, in case you're wondering, the order that I'm going to be putting them out is the order that I actually played them in. So, what does that mean for this video? We're going to be starting with Dark Souls 3. And before you ask, I do have an Xbox, so that means there's going to be no Bloodborne, no Demon Soul coverage, and honestly, I never even played Dark Souls 2, so I wouldn't be expecting any coverage of that at all. So with that out of the way, let me start with how I actually learned about Dark Souls 3. Let's see, I got an Xbox around the beginning of high school, and I was mainly a Call of Duty player, you know, just like most people at the time, but I was not very good. I was better at zombies. I could usually get to round 30 in zombies, but I was not very good at multiplayer, so I never really got into the whole lobby scene. I did play a little bit of Destiny, the original Destiny back in the day. I have since played Destiny 2, but I was never like super involved in that, mainly because I wasn't playing multiplayer, so I wasn't buying, the $60 live gameplay thing. And honestly, the internet that I had at the time wasn't the best for, online play. So online was just never my thing. I had other things going at the time, and yeah. By the time I was a junior in high school, I was much more involved in my local Taekwondo studio to be really doing a lot of gaming, but I still was playing occasionally. But what really got me back into gaming, funnily enough, was an overheard conversation I had during my senior year of high school. So let me just set the scene for you guys. We're in the year 2016. We are in the middle of an English class, I believe. And what am I hear from a conversation I overheard? I hear these two guys talking about one specific boss and how hard it was. The Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Honestly, I had no idea what the Boreal Valley was. I don't know what the Dancer of the Boreal Valley looks like. But I do specifically remember that one guy was so mad at the other for how quickly he beat the boss that he literally got up on a chair and screamed in the middle of class. It was wild. Granted, this is the same guy who went around in a Safeway shopping cart playing a didgeridoo on the final day of senior year, but That's a whole different story. I went home that day. I looked up what the dancer was, and I thought that was looked like a pretty cool game. But given that I didn't have an Xbox One, I really wasn't able to play the actual game. College rolled around. I decided to try out gaming again because I wasn't doing Taekwondo at the time. So I tried to play it on my laptop. The problem was is that the frame rate was so bad that I ended up getting a refund off of Steam. you know. Instead, I used the money to get a cheap copy of the Game of the Year version of Skyrim for the 360. And I played the hell out of that. I mean, it was the first RPG I'd ever played, and it turned out that I was way better at that than any of the shooting games that I had been playing previously. Fast forward to the year 2020, and I'm still doing college, but I'm back home now because there's this little thing called a small global pandemic where we're not really allowed to go outside because of all the shutdowns. My dad had previously bought an Xbox One, and get this, because it was a cheaper option to get a 4K Blu ray player than anything on the market at the time. And he wanted it to test out some of the surround sound and Atmos that he installed, which of course worked out for me because I was finally able to play the game. I decided to buy Dark Souls 3, which at the time was very cheap because everything was on sale on Amazon. So I was able to get an edition with had all of the DLCs on disc for super cheap. And I mean, I got a bunch of deals during that time. I got a lot of the games that I'll be talking about in this series around that time too. Gotta love me some physical games, but it's a dying breed now, and that's truly unfortunate. But now let's actually talk about the game itself. I decided to go in as blind as I possibly could, but because I didn't want to miss any of the bosses, I decided to look up how to get to all of the bosses. So, you could say, oh, that's not blind, but it's like, I didn't want to miss anything. So I was like, okay, are there certain things that lock me out of things? I figured that out, and I figured for the first couple it was fine. But when I did open the actual game, I didn't know anything about any of the class stats, didn't know what any of the stats meant, had no idea what any of the leveling systems were, and what any of the weapons really were worth using. So I decided to do some YouTube research to kind of figure out what I was doing and decided that if something looked cool or I got stuck somewhere, I'd just look it up because it seems to be a very alien kind of game to what I was used to. Initially, I wanted to do an Uchigatana run, but I had such a hard time beating the old swordsman that's like right next to the Fireling Shrine that I ended up looking up into other weapons that I could use as a backup. And that's when I found my boy for that playthrough, the Lothric Knight Sword. I put a sharp gem on it, and oh boy, I was off to the races. I ended up starting with a knight for the higher equip load, and then some decent health right off the bat. So I ended up pouring a bunch of stats into Dex right off the bat. But of course, I'm a sucker for, lightning magic, and I thought that healing would be a good idea for a playthrough. So I ended up putting some stats into Faith as well, to make it more of a Dex Faith kind of build, which kind of remained the bread and butter for the most of my playthroughs up until Elden Ring.
Oh, what's that? I can already hear it now. I can hear the strength build cults having an aneurysm in the comments. And honestly, with that, whine all you want in the comments. It's okay. If I see anything particularly funny, I might even feature it in some of the upcoming videos because honestly, you could play these games however you want. I'm not going to be too critical of like, oh, you're doing this, oh, you're not doing this, oh, you're not playing it the way that I want you to play. Is You have your opinions, it's fine.
I also bumped up my intelligence to 10 pretty quickly, mostly so that I could use some of the pyromancies as a backup option while I was waiting for the lightning spells to start coming online. But for my first playthrough, I only really got my intelligence up to 20, so it wasn't really doing much in terms of messing with scaling. But before I knew any of this, I had to make my way past Gundyr. Looking back on it, it really should have been an easy fight, but of course I had no prior knowledge, so it was a challenge. Not only did I not know how to parry, not only did I not know about fire bombs, I didn't even understand that there was a slight delay in control inputs, so I couldn't even roll properly. Oh my gosh. Rolling took me so long. It's honestly kind of sad how long it took me. But 30 tries later and a YouTube video that taught me that there was a delay input, I was off to the races and I had beaten Gundyr. Now for these videos, I also want to implement a ranking system. Oh baby, we got a tier list built into this video series. Now, why would I want to do ranking? Well, mainly because I thought it'd be interesting just to kind of see where I thought bosses were in comparison to not only within the game but also to across the games. Because I don't know if many people have done that, but I managed to build out a system for me to try and do that. So we're gonna see how it works. The ranking sort of went like this. I had about 5 categories. It was difficulty, uniqueness slash annoyance, and I'll break that down in a little bit. Design, abilities, and like the lore, soul reward kind of thing. I'd rank them from using 5 categories, least to best, and then I'd add up that score. I'd divide it by 5 for the 5 categories, and then I'd end up getting a rank overall for that game. And then I ported all of that information into a different spreadsheet where I was able to rank them across games so that I could come up with a master ranking of sorts. Of course, a lot of these rankings are subjective, but of course they always were gonna be. So, take the rankings that I end up giving them with a grain of salt. But I think overall they should reflect pretty genuinely to the design of the character overall. Because I was trying to not go for like, oh, this boss is harder, therefore he's going to be ranked higher or whatever. I was trying to go for a more holistic kind of view, so that's why I was adding things like, oh, I like this one's design. Oh, I like the aesthetic of this ability. Oh, I like the lore of this, just to help balance it out. Because obviously, some of the bosses in the first part of the game are always going to be beaten out by some of the ones in the last. But I wanted to help balance that out to give everything more of an even chance of really reflecting, the totality of these games. Trying to really understand which bosses are truly the best across games, both within singular games and across the series overall. So with that, let's get into how I actually beat Gundyr. Again, it was a slog. Honestly, it was terrible. Couldn't roll. Was barely able to use the weapons. I was sweating like crazy. 30 tries later, I lucked the hell out. I was finally able to beat him, and I was like, oh, thank God. But for the actual rankings, he ended up overall being 23rd in this game. And that came from a mixture of the fact that honestly his lore and his like soul reward weren't all that great. His aesthetic is mostly gray, so he didn't get a very good design score. His abilities, they were pretty just like melee, so that wasn't gonna get you very high compared to some of the other bosses later on. I found it to be pretty annoying for such an early boss. I mean, my goodness, did I struggle. And he wasn't even the most difficult boss. I found bosses later on that I felt were a lot easier. So overall, he came out in 23rd. There's probably going to be a graphic on the screen somewhere that's going to show the rankings somehow. I'll highlight it. But one thing I did get from Gundyr was the coiled sword. So I opened those doors, made my way up the Firelink, and circled around the center of the shrine for 5 minutes trying to figure out how to put the frickin' sword in the frickin' shrine so that I could go places. Ended up having to look up a tutorial to figure out how to do that. Apparently, there's some sort of like weird, buggy, finicky kind of thing where the hitbox is all over the place, and I had to actually look up an example of where the hitbox was so that I could finally put the sword in the shrine so that I could glow. But before I left, I tried the swordsman, got my ass kicked, got it kicked a couple more times, maybe 5, 10, 20, 30, and then I decided to leave. I remember the initial Lothric area being really, really confusing, which is kind of a joke looking back on it, but I was still having problems, landing attacks and rolling, so I was destined to get better no matter what. My time playing Skyrim, though, made it so that I tend to have a tendency of just exploring everything in a game. I, collect everything most of the time. Hence, the research into carrying weight. And I was, rolling through everything already. So when I learned that you had to search through every corner and that there were hidden walls, I was smacking everything with a sword. I was rolling through everything. It was a freaking mess. Eventually, I got to the place where you could grind for the Lothric Knight sword, and my goodness, I was there for like half an hour. But I eventually got the sword, and I was happy because that was the sword that I was going to use for the rest of my playthrough. And I was finally ready to fight Vort. Vort, honestly, for me, wasn't a huge challenge. I mean, yeah, he's big, but he's also really, really slow. And his ice, it was a cool aesthetic, but it wasn't giving me the most kind of trouble. I was mostly sticking behind him for most of my playthrough, and I was keeping my distance. But when I was actually hitting him, I was mostly sticking behind him, and I think that gave me a leg up. So I ended up not finding him uh, uh, super much of a challenge at all. His soul rewards, from what I remember, were pretty cool. I remember using the ring a lot in the first bit of the game. For his ranking overall, he came much higher than Gundyr. He came in 17th overall, and I think that was mainly because his lore and his soul reward were just so good. I mean, he ended up getting 12th, and that was his highest ranking across. He had decent aesthetic abilities because Ice was pretty cool. His design was also a lot better than Gundyr's at like 20. And then I didn't find him particularly annoying or anything, so that helped. But he wasn't very difficult, so I think that's what dropped him down from being any lower. Now, given that I had actually known that if you killed the lady, that the dancer would spawn, I didn't do that because obviously I had heard in the overheard conversation that the dancer of the Boreal Valley was this just like the hardest thing that had ever graced God's earth. So I was like, okay, let's avoid that entirely. So I ended up just getting the banner and I just went off to the undead settlement. So with the banner, I was able to make my way to the undead settlement. You get your cutscene, you land, and then you're able to find Yol. You can get to the bonfire relatively easily after you clear a few of the dogs. Oh, those dogs were kind of annoying, but it wasn't too bad. And then that's where I ended up calling it for my first night playing. So I think that's a worthy place of stopping the video, mainly because it just kind of wraps it up nicely. I think in the next part, I want to be covering all of the bosses through the Road to Sacrifice and the Crystal Sage, but that's more of a tentative thing. We'll see how far we get. So with that, I would say if you have any burning thoughts or comments, leave them in the comments and take care.